Have you ever asked yourself why the Vietnam War started in the first place? The roots of this devastating conflict reach deep into the soil of history, colored by geopolitical tensions and the heavy hand of colonialism. It all began with French Indochina, a federation of colonies established in Southeast Asia by France in the late 19th century. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were all under French rule, their rich resources and strategic location key to France's colonial ambitions. Yet, the winds of change were blowing. The Second World War, a global conflict that rocked the world, breathed new life into nationalistic sentiments. In Vietnam, the seeds of rebellion were sown. The Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, capitalized on the weakening grip of the French, who were beleaguered by the war. They envisioned a free and independent Vietnam. The conclusion of the Second World War did not bring peace to Vietnam. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new struggle. France, determined to regain control, clashed with the Viet Minh in what is now known as the First Indochina War. This conflict would set the stage for the larger war that was to come. It was the Geneva Accords of 1954 that further complicated matters. This international agreement divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, would follow a communist path, while the South, under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem, would lean towards the West. The division was meant to be temporary, a prelude to free elections. But those elections never came. Instead, the division sowed the seeds of a larger conflict. The Cold War, a global game of chess between the United States and the Soviet Union, found its battleground in Vietnam. The fear of a domino effect, where one country falling to communism would lead to others following suit, gripped the United States. They decided to intervene, supporting the South against the communist North. The stage was set, the actors in place, and the Vietnam War was just about to begin. As the world watched, Vietnam became a battleground. The year was 1955. The world was still reeling from the devastating impacts of the Second World War, and yet another war was on the horizon. This time, it was Vietnam. The Vietnam War, or the Second Indochina War as it's sometimes called, began in earnest in that year. The key player in this conflict, and the one we'll focus on today, was the United States. But why was the United States, a country halfway around the world, so invested in what was happening in Vietnam? The answer lies in a theory that gripped the minds of American policymakers at the time, the domino theory. The theory proposed that if one country in a region fell to communism, the surrounding countries would follow, much like a row of dominoes toppling over. In the context of the Cold War, this theory stoked the fears of the United States. They saw Vietnam, a country grappling with the spread of communism, as a potential domino. And so they decided to intervene, with the goal of halting the spread of communism. The U.S. involvement in Vietnam escalated in the early 1960s, but a particular event in 1964 would mark a turning point in the conflict. This was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On a quiet August day, the U.S. destroyer, the USS Maddox, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese naval vessels. This incident, whether it happened as reported or was exaggerated for political reasons, gave the U.S. government the justification it needed to escalate its involvement in Vietnam. The incident led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave then-President Lyndon B. Johnson the power to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. The result? The United States found itself more deeply entangled in the conflict, and the war escalated dramatically. While the world watched in silence, the war escalated, ensnaring both the Vietnamese people and American soldiers in a brutal conflict. The Vietnam War was not only a war of bullets and bombs, but also of hearts and minds. Imagine, if you will, the experiences of both soldiers and civilians during this period. It was a time when days were filled with fear and nights echoed with the sounds of distant explosions. It was a time when nobody knew if they would see the dawn of a new day. The war had become a brutal reality for everyone involved, and it was taking its toll. The use of chemical weapons, like Agent Orange, left a lasting impact, not only on the immediate victims, but also on generations to come. This defoliant, dropped from the skies, stripped the lush green jungles of Vietnam bare, leaving behind a barren landscape. But its effects were not limited to the environment. It seeped into the water, into the food, and into the very bodies of the people, causing birth defects and diseases that would last long after the final shot was fired. And then there was the psychological impact. Many soldiers returning home found themselves haunted by what they had seen and done. The term post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, entered our lexicon as a way to describe the psychological injuries that these men and women suffered. They returned from the war, but the war never left them. Their minds were battlegrounds, replaying the horrors of what they had experienced over and over again. Civilians, too, were not spared from this psychological warfare. The war was broadcasted into living rooms across America, turning dinner time into a front-row seat to the horrors unfolding half a world away. The images and stories that came through the television screens made it clear that this war was not just being fought on foreign soil. It was being fought in the hearts and minds of the American people. The war was taking a toll, not only on the battlefield, but also on the home front. The brutal reality of the Vietnam War was that it was a war without winners, only survivors carrying the scars of their experiences, both seen and unseen. As suddenly as it had escalated, the war came to a grinding halt. It was in the early days of 1973, amidst the chilling winter of Paris, that the Paris Peace Accords were signed. This marked the formal end of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, leaving behind a war-torn landscape and a nation in tatters. Yet, peace did not immediately follow the accords. The ominous shadow of war continued to loom over Vietnam until the fall of Saigon in April of 1975. This event signaled the conclusive end of the war, but it was also the beginning of a new era, one under communist rule. In the days leading up to the fall, the city was in chaos. American personnel, along with thousands of at-risk Vietnamese citizens, were hastily evacuated in what would come to be known as one of the largest helicopter evacuations in history. The images of desperate people clinging to the skids of American helicopters as they took off from the U.S. Embassy roof have since been etched into the collective memory of humanity. Once the last helicopter had disappeared over the horizon, the city fell silent. A new flag was hoisted over the presidential palace, marking the reunification of Vietnam under a single communist rule. The war had ended, but the nation was left scarred, its people weary, its land devastated. In the aftermath, the Vietnamese people faced a daunting task: to rebuild their nation from the ashes of war. They had to navigate through the challenges of a war-torn economy, a divided society, and a landscape scarred by years of brutal warfare. The war had indeed ended, but its impacts were far from over. The United States, on the other hand, returned home to a nation divided over the war's morality, its purpose, and its cost. The war had left a profound impact on American society and politics, sparking widespread protests and sparking a deep-seated skepticism towards government. The war ended, but its echoes continued to reverberate. The Vietnam War, a chapter of history that started in obscurity, ended in infamy, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape our world today. The Vietnam War left an indelible mark on both Vietnam and the United States. For Vietnam, the aftermath was a nation scarred, both physically and emotionally. The land was ravaged, ecosystems disrupted, and a generation left grappling with the horrors they'd witnessed. Economically, the country was on its knees. The war had drained resources, and recovery would take decades. Infrastructure needed rebuilding, industries needed reviving, and the people needed healing. For the United States, the war brought about a shift in perspective. A nation that had once believed in its invincibility was left questioning its role on the global stage. The Vietnam Syndrome, as it came to be known, was a collective sense of skepticism and disillusionment, a reluctance to engage in foreign wars without clear objectives and a defined exit strategy. It was a hard-learned lesson that would shape American foreign policy for years to come. The war also brought about a significant shift in the American political landscape. The government's handling of the war led to a loss of public trust, sparking widespread protests and civil unrest. This period of upheaval played a crucial role in shaping the social and political consciousness of a generation. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Vietnam War is the human cost. Lives lost, families torn apart, communities destroyed. The physical and psychological scars carried by veterans and civilians alike. The war served as a stark reminder of the devastating impact of conflict, not just on the battlefield, but on society as a whole. In the years since the war, both Vietnam and the United States have worked to heal these wounds. Vietnam has emerged as a growing economy, while the United States has strived to learn from its past mistakes. Yet, the legacy of the war continues to resonate, a poignant reminder of a turbulent chapter in history. The Vietnam War serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and the long shadow it casts.